Hi, my name is Richard Smith, and I'm the author of the book Such a Mind as This, a biblical theological study of thinking in the Old Testament. This video is about a mind that loves, based upon Deuteronomy 6, 4, and 5, which is often called the Shema. So let's begin with that passage. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Therefore, you shall love the Lord your God with your whole heart and with your whole being and with your whole strength. Now, the words in yellow are ones which I will emphasize and explain in the course of this presentation. First of all, hear, O Israel. The word hear is from the Hebrew imperative for listen to, hear, or obey. Hear, O Israel, was a summons. And in this case, a summons to hear and obey, to implement the theological credo of ancient Israel. And that was, the Lord is our God, or Yahweh is their God, the supreme deity. Now, Yahweh, of course, was the God that delivered them from Egypt, sustained them in the wilderness journey, and brought them into the promised land, had given them the law, and had blessed them in every conceivable possible way. This God was of such a nature that by definition, there was no other being possible. So this is a claim of ultimate reality, of absolute and total monotheism over against the other gods and polytheisms of the ancient Near East. And so you have the declaration, the Lord alone, followed by the word therefore, which in some versions is not made explicit, but in this case, it is a conceptual logical bridge to what follows. In other words, the credo begins with an indicative statement, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, and then therefore indicates the application or the necessary response or the imperative clause, which follows, in this case, in verse 5. And the first aspect of that that imperative command is to love. Now, it's important to understand what that term meant in the ancient Near East. It was not a romantic or primarily a romantic or emotional term, but a legal and political term. It indicated what was demanded of conquered peoples by the superior nation, in fact, by their king or theocracy. So it was, as I say, a legal term demanding covenantal loyalty of a vassal state. It was a commitment not to undermine the suzerain, the overlord, by affiliating with any opposing powers. In other words, prohibits rebellion under penalty of death. But there was also an affective dimension, an emotional dimension. The polytheisms, the theocracies, the empires of the ancient Near East sought to win over the hearts and minds with ideology, what we would call today propaganda. Again, love meant a demand, a political assessment of one's position vis-a-vis the possibility of rebellion or leaving the empire and the costs of doing so, so that loyalty, obedience, and honor to the king were prescribed in all forms of conniving, planning, considering rebellion and plotting were prohibited. In the biblical conception of love, in terms of covenant, there was also demand by God himself for loyalty and obedience to the transcendent God, Yahweh. And obviously, in the same sort of sense, except to a much greater degree, since we're dealing with the transcendent God or ruler of the universe and his empire among men, particularly among Israel, not to divert allegiance to other gods and their national domains. And this phrase was often expressed by the words turn aside in idolatry or apostasy, or turn aside to different kinds of wickedness or unrighteousness, bad behavior, and so forth. Obviously, God demanded that his people to learn to unthink or not think and behave like the other nations, because that would bring about their downfall. They weren't even to learn about other religions or devote their attention in that sort of way. And then, of course, there was an emotional aspect. In the case of Israel, love arose from gratitude for the abundant grace and provisions that God had provided for Israel. In other words, Yahweh didn't beat or conquer or destroy or plunder his people. Rather, he led them to abundance and to a place of flourishing. And then finally, divine imitation. As God manifested his beneficence and goodness and wisdom to Israel, then they were to mimic Yahweh's mindset as careful stewards and image bearers among the nations and, of course, within Israel. And once again, all kinds of plotting and scheming were prohibited. And then heart. Perhaps you've seen the video I produced, The Heart Thinks, or if you've read in my book, then you know that the heart functions as, the word heart, functions as a stand-in for mind or mindset. For in fact, there was no word for the brain in Hebrew in the Old Testament. So the heart functions as the intellectual center or rudder for the soul. One scholar called it the organ of knowing and understanding. But the heart possessed a mental capacity to receive data, inventory, categorize, and evaluate it according to the norms God had provided in his revelation. The heart, when it functions properly, discerns an essential fact about reality, that there is only one God, and that is Yahweh Elohim, and that all thinking and conduct must be conditioned by covenantal love. The next term, soul, is also a bit complicated depending on the context, but particularly in this context, refers to the whole person. In other words, a living body, mind, and so forth. And in this body, we experience desires and manifest and indulge in them in some cases, whether they be physical, psychological, spiritual, intellectual, whatever. In our soul, we experience and express longings, motivations, and passions. The soul curates our deepest motives, which are often hidden and are unknown to us. Our real aspirations, the real us, what one is willing to do, whether rightly or wrongly. One scholar put it, to love God with the soul means to advance one's devotion to God beyond all longings of a mental or physical sort. And that, of course, prohibits every kind of greed or envy, not just economical, but also for power, for influence, for love, etc., etc. For anything, actually, that defines us apart from God and his covenant. And lastly, the word strength. Strength also is a bit complicated, but in this context has an economic nuance, referring to stewardship of wealth and physical assets. But more than physical assets, it includes all that God gives us for his honor and the human well-being alone. And that includes, as I mentioned, immaterial assets, physical capacity, social capital, personal gifting, intellectual ability, directed for the glory of God and the blessing of mankind. In other words, nothing can be withheld for egoistic or secular motives or be directed to other gods in apostasy or idolatry. And then the word whole, you saw that it was repeated 3 times. This indicates that every aspect of life must be fully engaged in loving God with covenantal fidelity. The king of our empire is an absolute person, and his reign is totalistic. We are to learn to imitate his thoughts, his motives and beneficence to the world and to our fellow believers, and particularly in the church. So that loving God requires everything we possess at every moment, at every epoch in our life, and in every dimension, as I mentioned. Loving God loving others requires God-oriented thinking, desire, and conduct. So the Shema, Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 5, demonstrates the centrality of the mind in biblical spirituality and how thinking covenantally impacts every area of life. And if we had the time, it would demonstrate how thinking uncovenantally, or in an autonomous, rebellious way, also impacts every area of life quite negatively. So the mind, our desires, our soul, our capacity, our strength, in that order, should be dedicated to the Lord. We can diagram it in this way. The mind, or the heart, generates motives of the soul, which produces love and action, demonstrated by our capacity with all our might. Or finally, to state it this way, a mind that is governed by God's revelation and is submissive to him in all things generates godly motivation and desires, and promotes wise choices and actions that fosters stewardship that demonstrates love and action. So we begin with our mind, extend it and express through our soul and our capacities that God has given us for his glory and for the betterment of mankind.